Welcome back to Coffee with Giants. I'm Joshua Whitmore, and today my guest needs very little introduction, but I'll give him one anyway because he deserves it. He was a 3-time Formula One world champion. He drove in the rain like no one before or since. He cried on the podium. He prayed before races. He pushed so hard, so relentlessly that teammates broke trying to follow him. And on May 1st, 1994, at the age of 34, the world lost him at the San Marino Grand Prix in Imola, Italy. But what I want to talk about today isn't the legend, it's the man behind it. Because Ayrton Senna didn't just want to win, he wanted to understand why he was winning. And that question, that restless, almost spiritual hunger, is something I think every one of us can learn from. Senna, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Joshua. I must say, the coffee here is better than the paddock.
That's not a high bar. Let me start with something simple. When people talk about you, they always say natural talent. The greatest natural talent in Formula One history. Does that bother you?
It bothers me because it is incomplete. Yes, I had sensitivity for the car. I could feel things others could not feel, or perhaps others did not stop to listen for. But talent is not a gift you open and use. It is a seed, and seeds do not grow without work, without pain, without sacrifice. I started karting as a child, and even then, even as a boy, I was not satisfied to simply be fast. I needed to understand why I was fast. What was the car doing? What was the road doing? What was I doing? That obsession. People called it a gift, but obsession is not something given to you. It is something you choose every single day.
And that's exactly where I want to go. Because in the world we live in right now, and I think you'd find it fascinating and terrifying in equal measure, we are obsessed with shortcuts, life hacks, optimizations, AI that writes your essays, apps that learn your habits. We want the result without the road that leads to it. What do you make of that?
I understand the temptation, believe me. There were nights in my early career, before Formula One, racing in Formula Ford in England, living in a small flat, spending everything I had on tires and entry fees, where I asked myself, is this worth it? The shortcut would have been to go home to Brazil, to take my family's money, their connections, their comfortable life. Many people expected that of me, but here is what I learned. The road is what matters. When I had that extraordinary lap in qualifying at Monaco in 1984, I was lapping nearly 3 seconds faster than anyone else in the wet. Do you think that came from nowhere? It came from thousands of hours of feeling the limit, of going beyond the limit and coming back, of crashing and understanding why I crashed. You cannot skip that. If you skip it, you do not become excellent. You become a very convincing imitation of excellent.
That's a sharp distinction. The imitation of excellence. I think a lot of people live there without realizing it. They have the title, the results, the appearance, but something hollow underneath.
Yes, and you feel it. The person who has truly earned something, they are calm inside it. Not arrogant, calm. Because they know what it cost. They know every corner of what they built. The person who has imitated it, they are always afraid. Because somewhere they know the foundation is thin. I was afraid too, but not of that. I was afraid of not being everything I could be. That is a different kind of fear. A healthy fear. It pushes you forward.
Let's talk about that fear for a moment, because Imola 1994, that whole weekend, was unlike anything. It didn't start on Sunday, it started on Friday when Rubens Barrichello had a horrific crash in practice. He survived, but people saw it, you saw it. Then Saturday, Roland Ratzenberger died in qualifying. A driver you didn't know extremely well, but a fellow racer, a human being, and you still got in the car on Sunday. What was going through your mind?
That weekend broke something in me. When Rubens crashed on Friday, the violence of it, the helplessness of watching and waiting, I felt a darkness I had not felt before. I went to see him. He was alive, thank God, but I could not shake it. And then Roland, Saturday. I went to the medical center. I saw. I knew. That night I called my family in Brazil. I cried. I, who had always found a way to contain my fear and turn it into speed, I did not know what to do with what I was feeling. I sat with the Austrian flag. Roland was Austrian. I had decided that if I won on Sunday, I would lift his flag on the podium. I had it in the cockpit with me. I wanted him to cross that finish line too, in some way.
That detail, the flag in the cockpit. I don't think most people know that.
It was not for the cameras, it was between me and him, between me and God, because I needed to believe that what we do, what we risk, means something, that it connects us to each other, not only separates us. But to answer your question, I will tell you something I once said, and I mean it completely. If you no longer go for a gap that exists, you are no longer a racing driver. I do not mean this only for racing. I mean it for life. There is always a gap, an opening, a moment where something is possible that was not possible before. Most people see the gap and hesitate. They calculate the risk for so long that the gap closes, and then they spend years telling themselves it was never really there. The fear is real. I do not dismiss it. At Imola that Sunday, I had fears I had never felt before. Something was wrong. With the car, with the weekend, with everything. But I had a responsibility to myself, to my country, to Roland. And I believed, perhaps I was wrong to believe, perhaps not, that I was the right person to face that moment. Excellence requires you to face your moments, not recklessly, but fully, with everything you are.
You mentioned the rain at Monaco. People called it a gift, supernatural even, but I suspect you saw it very differently. Why were you so fast in the wet?
It was not supernatural, it was the opposite. It was intensely, painfully natural. Let me explain. In the dry, a great driver can lean on the car, on the downforce, on the grip, on the machinery. The car hides some of your mistakes. In the rain, it hides nothing. The rain is honest. Every error is immediately punished. So most drivers, even great ones, they tighten. They become cautious. They drive away from the limit because they are afraid of what the rain will reveal about them. I did the opposite. I leaned into it.
So it wasn't a gift. It was training your sensitivity to a level where the rain became an advantage over people who hadn't done that work.
Exactly. The rain equalizes downward for those who are not ready. For those who are ready, it elevates. And that is true of any difficult condition in life. The people who have done the inner work, who know themselves, who have sat with discomfort long enough to understand it, difficult conditions do not destroy them. Difficult conditions reveal them.
Speaking of conditions that aren't perfect, I want to bring up something specific because I think it speaks directly to what people face every day. 1991 Brazilian Grand Prix, your home race, you're leading, and your gearbox starts to fail. You're stuck in 6th gear for the final laps. You can barely hold the wheel. You cross the finish line in agony. You could barely lift your arm to celebrate, and they had to lift you out of the car. You won. Why didn't you stop?
Because I was at home. But beyond that, because stopping is a decision you can always make. Continuing is the decision that costs you something. And I had learned very early that the moments when everything is breaking down around you, those are precisely the moments that define what you are made of. Not the perfect laps. Anyone can drive well when the car is perfect and the sun is out. What reveals you is the broken gearbox, the rain, the competitor who will not give you room. That day in Sao Paulo, my hands stopped working properly from the effort of forcing the gear, and I thought, good, because the pain means I am still here. The pain means I have not given up. When it stopped hurting, I would worry.
That's almost a philosophy of suffering.
It is a philosophy of completion. Suffering for its own sake is meaningless. But suffering in pursuit of something true, something you have chosen fully, that is not suffering. That is the cost of being alive in the deepest sense. Most people abandon their race 3 laps before the finish, not because they cannot continue, because they decide the discomfort is a signal to stop, when in fact it is a signal that they are close.
I want to ask you about Brazil, because your relationship with your country was not just patriotic, it was almost redemptive. You spoke about using your visibility to show what Brazilians could achieve at a time of enormous inequality and pain. For people watching today who feel like their success is just personal, just for them, what do you say?
I say you are not only yourself. You never were. When I won my first World Championship in 1988, I wept on the podium, and I thought of every Brazilian child who was poor, who was hungry, who had been told their country was not capable of greatness. I was not crying for me. I was crying for them, because I knew they were watching, and I knew that what they saw in me, they could now imagine for themselves. This is not a burden. This is the secret to sustaining excellence over time. If you are excellent only for yourself, for your own glory, your own comfort, it becomes empty. I have seen drivers with enormous talent disappear because there was nothing underneath the speed, no why. But when your excellence serves something larger than you, it becomes inexhaustible. It feeds itself.
We're almost out of time, and I have to ask you this. You once had a qualifying lap at Monaco, you've mentioned it, where you described something almost mystical happening. You said you felt like you were in a tunnel, that you were no longer consciously driving. What was that?
I was afraid of it, actually. When I came back to myself, I stopped the car, I called my engineers and told them I was coming in. Because at that moment I realized something else was happening, something I could not control and could not explain. I think when you have prepared completely, when you have worked until there is nothing left to add, when you have pushed through every broken gearbox and every wet track and every moment where quitting would have been easier, sometimes you get out of your own way. And then what emerges is not you exactly, it is the best of you, the version of you that all the work was building toward. But here is what I want people to understand. That moment is not the gift. That moment is the receipt, the proof of everything that came before. You do not chase it, you earn it. 1 lap at a time.
1 lap at a time. Excellence doesn't come easy. That's what this conversation keeps coming back to, not as a warning, but as a kind of relief. Because if excellence were a gift, most of us would have no claim to it. But it's not. It's a decision, made in the rain, made with a broken gearbox, made the morning after the worst weekend of your life, when you still get in the car. Ayrton Senna didn't become the greatest racing driver in history because of what he was born with. He became it because of what he refused to put down. Thank you for watching Coffee with Giants. If this conversation moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that what they're building, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, is worth it. See you next time.